What's the Israel-Palestine conflict about? The Israeli-Palestinian conflict has claimed tens of thousands of lives and displaced many millions of people and has its roots in a colonial act carried out more than a century ago. For decades, Western media outlets, academics, military experts and world leaders have described the Israeli-Palestinian conflict as intractable, complicated and deadlocked. Here's a simple guide to break down one of the world's longest-running conflicts. What was the Balfour Declaration? More than 100 years ago, on November 2, 1917, Britain's then Foreign Secretary, Arthur Balfour, wrote a letter addressed to Lionel Walter Rothschild, a figurehead of the British Jewish community. The letter was short, just 67 words, but its contents had a seismic effect on Palestine that is still felt to this day. It committed the British government to the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and to facilitating the achievement of this object. The letter is known as the Balfour Declaration. In essence, a European power promised the Zionist movement a country where Palestinian Arab natives made up more than 90% of the population. A British mandate was created in 1923 and lasted until 1948. During that period, the British facilitated mass Jewish immigration. Many of the new residents were fleeing Nazism in Europe, and they also faced protests and strikes. Palestinians were alarmed by their country's changing demographics and British confiscation of their lands to be handed over to Jewish settlers. What happened during the 1930s? Escalating tensions eventually led to the Arab Revolt, which lasted from 1936 to 1939. In April 1936, the newly formed Arab National Committee called on Palestinians to launch a general strike, withhold tax payments and boycott Jewish products to protest British colonialism and growing Jewish immigration. The 6-month strike was brutally repressed by the British, who launched a mass arrest campaign and carried out punitive home demolitions, a practice that Israel continues to implement against Palestinians today. The second phase of the revolt began in late 1937 and was led by the Palestinian Peasant Resistance Movement, which targeted British forces and colonialism. By the second half of 1939, Britain had massed 30,000 troops in Palestine. Villages were bombed by air, curfews imposed, homes demolished, and administrative detentions and summary killings were widespread. In tandem, the British collaborated with the Jewish settler community and formed armed groups and a British-led counterinsurgency force of Jewish fighters named the Special Night Squads. Within the Yishuv, the pre-state settler community, arms were secretly imported and weapons factories established to expand the Haganah, the Jewish paramilitary that later became the core of the Israeli army. In those 3 years of revolt, 5,000 Palestinians were killed, 15,000 to 20,000 were wounded and 5,600 were imprisoned. What was the UN partition plan? By 1947, the Jewish population had ballooned to 33% of Palestine, but they owned only 6% of the land. The United Nations adopted Resolution 181, which called for the partition of Palestine into Arab and Jewish states. The Palestinians rejected the plan because it allotted about 55% of Palestine to the Jewish state, including most of the fertile coastal region. At the time, the Palestinians owned 94% of historic Palestine and comprised 67% of its population. The 1948 Nakba, or the ethnic cleansing of Palestine. Even before the British mandate expired on May 14, 1948, Zionist paramilitaries were already embarking on a military operation to destroy Palestinian towns and villages to expand the borders of the Zionist state that was to be born. In April 1948, more than 100 Palestinian men, women and children were killed in the village of Deir Yassin on the outskirts of Jerusalem. That set the tone for the rest of the operation, and from 1947 to 1949, more than 500 Palestinian villages, towns and cities were destroyed in what Palestinians refer to as the Nakba, or catastrophe, in Arabic. An estimated 15,000 Palestinians were killed, including in dozens of massacres. The Zionist movement captured 78% of historic Palestine. The remaining 22% was divided into what are now the occupied West Bank and the besieged Gaza Strip. An estimated 750,000 Palestinians were forced out of their homes. Today, their descendants live as 6 million refugees in 58 squalid camps throughout Palestine and in the neighboring countries of Lebanon, Syria, Jordan and Egypt. On May 15, 1948, Israel announced its establishment. The following day, the First Arab-Israeli War began and fighting ended in January 1949 after an armistice between Israel and Egypt, Lebanon, Jordan and Syria. In December 1948, the UN General Assembly passed Resolution 194, which calls for the right of return for Palestinian refugees. The years after the Nakba, at least 150,000 Palestinians remained in the newly created State of Israel and lived under a tightly controlled military occupation for almost 20 years before they were eventually granted Israeli citizenship. Egypt took over the Gaza Strip, and in 1950, Jordan began its administrative rule over the West Bank. In 1964, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, PLO, was formed, and a year later, the Fatah political party was established. The Nakba, or the Six-Day War and the Settlements. On June 5, 1967, Israel occupied the rest of historic Palestine, including the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, East Jerusalem, the Syrian Golan Heights and the Egyptian Sinai Peninsula during the Six-Day War against a coalition of Arab armies. For some Palestinians, this led to a second forced displacement, or Nakba, which means setback in Arabic. In December 1967, the Marxist-Leninist Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine was formed. Over the next decade, a series of attacks and plane hijackings by leftist groups drew the world's attention to the plight of the Palestinians. Settlement construction began in the occupied West Bank and Gaza Strip. A two-tier system was created with Jewish settlers afforded all the rights and privileges of being Israeli citizens, whereas Palestinians had to live under a military occupation that discriminated against them and barred any form of political or civic expression. The First Palestinian Intifada erupted in the Gaza Strip in December 1987 after 4 Palestinians were killed when an Israeli truck collided with 2 vans carrying Palestinian workers. It also led to the establishment of the Hamas movement, an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood that engaged in armed resistance against the Israeli occupation. The Israeli army's heavy-handed response was encapsulated by the "break their bones" policy advocated by then Defense Minister Yitzhak Rabin. It included summary killings, closures of universities, deportations of activists and destruction of homes. The Second Intifada began on September 28, 2000, when Likud opposition leader Ariel Sharon made a provocative visit to the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound with thousands of security forces. Clashes between Palestinian protesters and Israeli forces killed 5 Palestinians and injured 200 over 2 days. Israel has launched 4 protracted military assaults on Gaza, in 2008, 2012, 2014 and 2021. Thousands of Palestinians have been killed, including many children, and tens of thousands of homes, schools and office buildings have been destroyed. In 2014, over a span of 50 days, Israel killed more than 2,100 Palestinians, including 1,462 civilians and close to 500 children. During the assault, Called Operation Protective Edge by the Israelis, about 11,000 Palestinians were wounded, 20,000 homes were destroyed and 500,000 people displaced.